Story number 1. The Creature in the Basement. It was a quiet town, the kind of place you'd forget existed unless you were born there. Bexley Falls, Maine, had a population that barely cracked 1,000. But even in a town so small, things could still go terribly wrong. It wasn't the kind of town you'd expect to see anything out of the ordinary. But then, something began to happen. People started to disappear. At first, it was just rumors, whispers behind closed doors, nervous glances in the post office. But as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that something was wrong. Bobby Thompson had just moved to Bexley Falls, the son of a father who was an accountant and a mother who couldn't quite make up her mind about what she wanted out of life. He didn't know much about the town, just that it was supposed to be peaceful. No one ever mentioned the disappearances. His parents were too busy with their own lives to notice the strange happenings that had started to plague the streets. It was the house next door that caught his attention. It was old, its windows covered in thick black curtains that never seemed to move, even when the wind howled through the trees. The house looked abandoned, but Bobby knew it wasn't. He could hear voices sometimes, muffled, like a TV left on in another room. And there was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up whenever he was near the place. It was the basement. Bobby could feel it. A strange, sickening pull that drew him in every time he passed the house. It was as if the basement itself was calling to him, beckoning him to find out what was hidden behind that rusted door. The first time he'd tried to sneak around the back, he was stopped by Mr. Miller, the elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down. "Don't go near that house, Bobby," Mr. Miller had said in a voice that was barely a whisper. "You don't know what's down there." At the time, Bobby had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man, but the words stuck with him. Days passed, and Bobby's curiosity grew. He noticed that people who had come into town before the disappearances, people who didn't belong, seemed to come and go from that house. They'd never been seen again. It was always the same. Quiet people, too polite to make eye contact and always disappearing. It was like they were swallowed by the town. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the darkness crept over the streets, Bobby couldn't resist any longer. He slipped away from his parents' house and made his way to the neighbors'. The old house loomed in front of him, its dark windows watching him, waiting. He crept through the yard, the grass cold beneath his feet, and finally reached the back door, just as he had planned. It was unlocked. The basement door was exactly as he had imagined it, rusted, heavy, and barely hanging on its hinges. Bobby's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop now. He had to know what was in that basement. He pushed the door open, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the darkness. As his foot touched the final step, the air around him seemed to grow colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're not alone. Bobby turned on his flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as he saw it. The creature was a thing of nightmares, twisted and wrong. Its body was like a mangled human, but the skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, its eyes bulging and wide, watching Bobby with an unnatural hunger. Its fingers curled like claws, and its mouth was a jagged mess of teeth, dripping with something that glistened in the flashlight's beam. But the worst part was its face. It wasn't just a face. It was a mask. A mask of someone Bobby recognized. The face of the man who had disappeared last month. The creature didn't move. It just stared at Bobby, its hollow eyes filled with a kind of twisted sadness. It wasn't just a monster. It was the town's curse, its secret. Bobby felt the weight of it settle in his stomach, and the realization hit him like a freight train. The creature in the basement wasn't just hiding in the shadows. It was the town. It was the thing that had been feeding on the people who vanished, turning them into monsters, trapping them down here for God knows how long. Bobby stumbled back, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. The creature didn't chase him, but its eyes followed him as he backed out of the basement. The door slammed shut behind him, and he ran. He didn't stop until he was home, safe in his room, the sounds of the creature still echoing in his mind. He never spoke of what he'd seen. The town went on as if nothing had happened, but Bobby couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by the creature but by the town itself. He began to see the truth in Mr. Miller's words. The creature in the basement wasn't just some figment of imagination. It was real, and it wasn't the only one. And as Bobby lay in bed that night with the darkness pressing in around him, he knew one thing for certain. Bexley Falls wasn't a quiet town. It was a place where people disappeared for good. It was a place where things were hidden in the dark, waiting to be discovered by the next curious soul who dared to look too deep. Bobby Thompson wouldn't be the last, but he would be the first to know what truly lived in the dark. Story number 2: The Shadow That Follows. Jason Miller had never been the type to believe in ghosts or demons. He was a practical man, a man of logic. If something bad happened, it was just bad luck. If he saw something strange, it was probably stress or exhaustion. After all, he'd been working nonstop at the law firm for months. Long hours, endless paperwork, and clients who never seemed satisfied. The stress had begun to wear him thin, his sleep patterns were messed up, and his appetite was shot. But none of that could explain what happened to him, not in a way that made sense. It started small, just a flicker out of the corner of his eye, a dark shape that seemed to shift in the shadows. He thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, a result of too many late nights. But then it happened again, this time while he was walking through his living room. He paused, staring at the space where the shadow had been, but there was nothing there, just the same old empty room. "Get a grip, Jason," he muttered to himself. "You're just tired." The next day, it followed him again. This time, he was at the grocery store, picking out tomatoes when he saw it. A dark figure, shifting just beyond his peripheral vision. He turned, but no one was there. His heartbeat quickened. He could feel his palms starting to sweat, but he shrugged it off. He was just tired. He needed to relax, maybe take a weekend off, clear his head. But the shadow didn't leave him. It was always there, just out of sight, always watching. The more Jason tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow. He'd catch glimpses of it in mirrors, in windows, in the corners of rooms. It followed him into work. He'd catch it in his office, behind his desk or by the window, lurking in the reflection of his computer screen. He began to wonder if he was losing his mind. By the time the shadow showed up during his morning run, Jason was barely holding it together. He had been jogging through the park, trying to clear his head, when he saw it. There it was, standing in the distance, its shape darker than the shadows of the trees around it. For the first time, he stopped running. He stood frozen, staring at it, heart pounding in his chest. It was like a man, but wrong. The shape was twisted, distorted. No, that wasn't right. It was too tall, too thin, its edges blurred like smoke. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a featureless void, just a blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Jason took a step back, then another, and then he ran. He ran like he'd never run before, his breath ragged, his legs burning. But the shadow, always the shadow, kept pace with him. For the next few days, Jason tried everything. He stayed home, shut himself off from the world, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. The shadow followed him everywhere. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It was in every corner of his apartment, lurking in every dark space. The more he tried to escape it, the stronger it became. He'd see it in the reflection of his bathroom mirror, standing behind him, waiting. He'd feel its presence in the backseat of his car, its cold breath on his neck as he drove. And then, one night, as he lay in bed, too exhausted to sleep but too afraid to close his eyes, he heard something. A whisper. It came from the darkness, the same darkness that surrounded the shadow. His breath hitched in his throat as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Jason, Jason, you can't escape me." His blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He had known it once, many years ago, buried deep in his memories. A memory he had tried so hard to forget. The shadow wasn't just a shadow, it was him. It was the part of him he had buried deep inside, the guilt, the fear, the shame. It was the dark secret he had never faced. The accident he'd caused when he was just a kid, the life he had taken, the family he had destroyed. It had been following him all this time, waiting for the moment when he would finally break, when the guilt would be too much to bear, when the shadow would come to claim him. Jason sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for the light, but the shadow was already there, standing in the corner of his room. The air grew thick and cold, the darkness pressing in on him. It wasn't just following him now, it was consuming him. "Please," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "Please go away." But the shadow didn't leave. It never left. With a final, sickening crack, the shadow surged forward, enveloping him completely. Jason's screams were swallowed up by the darkness, and the last thing he heard was the whisper again, growing louder. "You can't escape me, Jason. You never could." The next morning, Jason was gone. His apartment was found empty, the lights still flickering as if he had just been there. But there was no sign of him. No struggle, no trace. Just an empty room, a cold silence, and the faintest shadow in the corner, just beyond the reach of the light. And the shadow, it waited. Story number 3. The Fog of Old Town. Old Town had always been quiet, the kind of place where the days seemed to drag on, and the nights fell heavy with an eerie stillness. It was a town that had lived in the shadow of its own past, a past no one wanted to talk about. People went about their lives just trying to survive. They had their routines, their small-town politics, and their secrets. But nothing ever seemed quite right about Old Town. Not until the fog came. At first, it was easy to ignore. A heavy mist that rolled in every evening, creeping along the streets like something alive. People talked about it in hushed tones, their voices tinged with nervousness. The fog didn't seem like a natural fog. It wasn't like the fog you saw on a cold morning or from the river banks. This fog was thick, unnaturally thick. It swallowed the streets whole, blurring everything within it, like the world had been erased. And then, the disappearances started. It was always the same. Someone would be walking home after a long day of work, or sitting in their front yard when the fog rolled in. By the next morning, they were gone, vanished into the mist without a trace. No one could explain it. Some blamed the fog. Others said it was just coincidence, but deep down, everyone knew something was wrong. People were afraid to leave their homes at night. The fog was dangerous. And what was worse, it seemed to be growing stronger. Jonah Davis wasn't a believer in superstition. He didn't put stock in rumors or ghost stories. He was just a mechanic, the kind of man who spent his days fixing old engines and his nights with his wife, Linda. They had a small house on Maple Street, just a few blocks from the heart of the town. Jonah had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had, but he never paid much attention. Until one night, when the fog rolled in heavier than ever. Jonah had finished a long shift at the shop and was heading home. It was close to midnight, and the fog had already begun to form in the streets. It looked like a wall of gray creeping up the sidewalk, swallowing everything in its path. Jonah quickened his pace, trying to outrun it, but the fog moved faster than he did. He reached his front porch and glanced over his shoulder, but the fog had already consumed the street behind him. And then, something moved in it. Jonah froze, staring into the mist, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought he saw something, a figure, dark and tall, moving in the fog. But it wasn't a person, it was something else. The shape was wrong. It was too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched out like a creature from a nightmare. Jonah's breath hitched in his throat as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though it was tied to another reality, one that didn't belong in this world. It was like the fog itself was alive, and the creature was part of it, emerging from somewhere no one could understand. Jonah turned and ran inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart was racing, but Linda was already awake, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. "They're out there, Jonah," she whispered. "I saw them too." Jonah didn't need to ask who they were. The creatures in the fog, the ones that took people, the ones that were hunting them. The next morning, the town was in a panic. More people had disappeared overnight. Entire families had vanished without a trace. The fog had gotten worse, thicker than it had ever been. It seemed to stretch across the town like a living thing, wrapping around homes, curling down alleys and choking the streets. A small group of survivors, Jonah, Linda, a few neighbors and a handful of strangers, gathered in the town's church. They were scared, desperate, but they knew they had to do something. They couldn't just sit there and wait to be taken. "We have to figure out where it's coming from," Jonah said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "There's got to be something behind it, some reason why it's here." The others nodded, their faces pale. They were all afraid, but they knew Jonah was right. The fog wasn't just a freak accident. It was deliberate. Something, or someone, was controlling it. The group set out at night, sticking to the edges of town, avoiding the thickest parts of the fog. They moved quickly, trying to make it to the old library on the outskirts of Old Town. The library was said to be the oldest building in town, dating back to the late 1800s, and it was rumored to hold secrets buried deep within its dusty archives. They reached the library just as the fog began to roll in again. The air grew thick with it, the mist curling around their feet like cold fingers. As they stepped inside, Jonah's flashlight flickered and dimmed. The library was dark, the shelves towering above them, filled with old, forgotten books. They didn't have much time. Jonah and the others began searching through the books, looking for anything that could explain the fog. It didn't take long before they found it. A journal, hidden between two old volumes, its pages yellow and brittle with age. The journal belonged to a man named Dr. Isaac Harrow, an old scientist who had lived in Old Town decades ago. According to his notes, Harrow had been experimenting with alternate realities, trying to open gateways between worlds. He had been obsessed with the idea that the fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a doorway, one that led to a parallel universe. And the creatures? They were the inhabitants of that other world. Jonah's stomach twisted as he read the final entry. "They're coming for us," the journal said, "and there's no stopping them." The ground beneath them shook. The creatures had found them. The fog had come not by accident but by design, and now there was no escape. As the creatures emerged from the mist, their monstrous forms flickering in and out of reality, Jonah knew one thing for certain. The fog wasn't going away. It was just the beginning. And Old Town would never be the same again. The town was lost. Story number 4. The Howling of Dread. The Barlow family thought they had found the perfect escape. After years of living in the city, the constant noise, the endless traffic, the people pressing in on them, they needed peace. The farmhouse in the middle of nowhere was just what they needed. A place to slow down, reconnect, and leave the chaos behind. It was tucked away on a patch of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. They'd heard the rumors about the house. Strange stories from the locals, whispers that didn't make sense at the time. "You sure you want to live out there?" Old Man Riley had asked when they first came to town. "That land's got a history, you know, a bad one. Folks who lived there before, well, they didn't stay long." Of course, they had laughed it off. Who would believe in ghost stories when they could taste the fresh country air and feel the cool breeze blowing through the trees? For Samantha and Greg Barlow, it seemed like the start of something new, something peaceful for their 2 young children, Emily and Ben. The house was old, yes, but sturdy. The garden was overgrown, but with some work it could be beautiful again. The first few nights were perfect. They ate dinner together around the wooden table, played games in the living room, and then, when the day faded to night, they'd head upstairs to bed, the quietness of the countryside settling around them. It felt right, it felt like home. But that was before the howling started. At first, it was faint, a distant sound, almost like a dog barking in the woods. Greg thought nothing of it. Maybe a wild animal or some stray dog that had wandered too far from its owner. But it happened again the next night, and the next. The howls grew louder, echoing across the dark fields, rising and falling like something, or someone, was in pain. It was strange and unsettling. The Barlows tried to ignore it. They chalked it up to the wild animals that roamed the land, maybe coyotes or some kind of large cat. But the sound kept getting closer. The nights became unbearable as the howls grew louder and more disturbing, twisting in their ears like a creeping fog. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness wrapped its fingers around the farmhouse, Greg decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and told Samantha he'd be back in an hour, just to see if he could catch a glimpse of the creature making the noise. Samantha didn't want him to go. She felt an uneasy chill run through her spine, something she couldn't quite explain, but Greg was determined. He kissed her forehead, told her not to worry, and stepped out into the night. The air outside was thick and damp, the kind of night that made the hairs on your neck stand on end. Greg walked toward the edge of the property where the woods began. The howling was louder now, almost deafening. It sounded closer than ever. As he reached the tree line, the woods seemed to close in around him, the wind whistling through the branches like a warning. And then, through the darkness, he saw it. The shape was large, moving swiftly through the trees. It was too big to be a coyote or any animal Greg knew. It had long limbs, and its body seemed to shift and distort with every step. It wasn't quite human, and it wasn't quite animal. It was something else, something unnatural. Greg's breath caught in his throat. He took a step backward, his heart pounding. And then, to his horror, the creature stopped moving. It turned its head slowly, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light that pierced the dark. Greg didn't move. He couldn't. The creature let out a howl, this time right in front of him, so loud that it felt like the sound was inside his skull. And then, to his utter disbelief, it started to change. Its body twisted and rippled, and where the monstrous creature had once stood, a new shape began to form. It was Samantha, but not quite. Her face was distorted, her eyes too wide, her mouth twisted into a horrific grin. It was her, but it wasn't. The thing that stood before Greg mimicked his wife's voice, calling to him, "Greg, come back to me. It's just me, honey." But there was nothing loving in the voice. There was only cold, dark malice. Greg took a step back, his mind racing. What was it? What had happened to his wife? But then, the thing stepped closer and the air grew colder. It was no longer Samantha. It was something else. Something shape-shifting, something terrifying. Greg turned and ran, not looking back. He didn't stop until he burst through the door of the farmhouse, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. Samantha and the kids were waiting for him, just as he had left them. His wife's face was full of concern as she asked, "What's wrong, Greg?" The howling had stopped, but the terror in Greg's eyes didn't. "That thing in the woods," he whispered, voice shaky. It took her form. It can become anyone, anything." Samantha tried to laugh it off, to reassure him, but Greg wasn't listening. His eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that seemed out of place. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. Ben, his son. But Ben wasn't standing still. He was moving, his body shifting unnaturally, his face stretching. The child he loved was no longer the boy he knew. It was the thing, the shapeshifter. The howling began again, louder than ever, closer. And Greg knew in that moment that the nightmare had only just begun. The shapeshifter wasn't an animal. It wasn't a creature from the woods. It was something worse, something that could become anyone. And in the silence of that farmhouse, the Barlow family was not alone. The howler was inside. Story number 5. The Forgotten Beast of Harrington Creek. It wasn't the kind of place anyone went on purpose. Harrington Creek had always been the subject of whispers. The locals in the small town of Ridgeline talked about it in low voices, especially around the campfire or over drinks at the bar. It was the kind of place you stayed away from, a forgotten stretch of land where the trees grew thick and the water ran dark and still. But for 5 teenagers looking for a thrill, it seemed like the perfect place for a weekend escape. Ben, Sarah, Emily, Mark, and Jake had been planning the trip for weeks. They were tired of the same old weekend routine: movies, mall trips, and endless texting. They wanted adventure. So when Ben found an old map tucked away in the back of a dusty bookstore, showing a forgotten path to Harrington Creek, they couldn't resist. The map seemed like a challenge, an invitation to something mysterious. And what better way to prove they were fearless than by heading to the one place everyone in Ridgeline avoided? "Nothing's gonna happen," Ben said as he loaded up his truck with camping gear. "It's just some old creek. How bad can it be?" But even as he said it, something in the back of his mind told him he wasn't so sure. The first night, the place seemed just as quiet as they had imagined. The creek was far from the main road, tucked away behind a thick forest, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. They set up camp by the water, laughing and joking, but something felt off. The air felt heavier than it should have been. Every now and then, they'd hear a noise, a branch snapping, the soft splash of something moving in the creek, but they shrugged it off, "It's just a deer," Mark said, after one particularly loud crash in the distance. "Or maybe a raccoon, no big deal." But as the sun set, a strange feeling began to settle over them, something they couldn't explain. It wasn't just the typical nervousness you'd expect in a new place. It felt deeper, darker, like something had been waiting for them. Around midnight, as they sat around the fire, Emily was the first to hear it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the earth. It was so deep, so chilling, that it vibrated through the ground beneath them. The fire crackled, and for a moment no one spoke. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. They all looked at each other. Ben was the first to laugh it off, but there was something in his eyes. Something that said he wasn't so sure either. "It's probably just a bear," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something ancient. The next morning, the group tried to shake off the unease. They packed up and hiked further into the woods, determined to explore the creek and see where it led. But as they walked, they couldn't help but notice something odd. The trees seemed to grow taller, the path narrowing, the air growing thicker. The sun had risen, but the forest felt suffocatingly dark. Then they came to it. A cave. It wasn't on the map. There was no mention of it in any of the local stories. It was just there, hidden behind a cluster of twisted trees and vines. The entrance was narrow, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, but the scent of something old and rotten, came from within. "Should we go in?" Jake asked, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. He looked at the others, but none of them had an answer. Ben was the first to step forward. "It's probably nothing," he said, his voice far less confident than he intended. "Just an old hollow. We'll check it out for a minute, then leave." They all hesitated, but one by one they followed Ben inside. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and the air inside felt thick with the weight of years. They moved deeper, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the jagged rocks. And then they found it, the creature. It was like nothing they'd ever seen. It was massive, its body twisted and malformed, with dark scales and huge, sharp claws. Its eyes were pitch black, like voids that pulled in all the light around them. It had been buried here, hidden for centuries, trapped beneath the weight of the earth. Its body was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but it was alive. And now, it was awake. The moment they saw it, the creature let out a terrible roar that shook the cave, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. Ben, Sarah, Emily, Mark, and Jake froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. But there was no time to run. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its massive claws scraping against the stone as it surged toward them. They turned and ran, but the cave twisted and turned, as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. The further they ran, the louder the creature's roars became, echoing in the narrow tunnels like thunder. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was angry, furious. It wasn't just hungry, it was vengeful. They made it to the entrance, but only 4 of them emerged. Mark never made it out. His scream echoed behind them, followed by the sickening sound of bones snapping. The others didn't stop to look back. The creature followed them, relentless, its roars growing louder, closer. They ran through the forest, crashing through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast they ran, the creature was always there, just behind them, just out of reach. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they realized something. The creature wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let them leave. Harrington Creek had always been a place of forgotten things, forgotten memories, forgotten histories, and now, forgotten creatures. And it had been waiting for someone to wake it up. By the time the authorities found them, the only thing left behind was a pile of broken camping gear and a few scattered belongings. No bodies. No sign of the 5 teenagers who had wandered into the woods that day. But the creature of Harrington Creek, it was still there, and it would wait for the next ones to come. The forgotten beast would never be forgotten again. Story number 6. The Hollow-Eyed Man. The town of Vesper Hollow had always been a quiet place. Nestled in the hills, far from the busy world, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where things never seemed to change. But there was a dark secret, one that the townspeople whispered about, especially at night, when the shadows stretched long and the wind carried a chill. It all started years ago, with the death of a man named Samuel Graves. Samuel was a quiet soul, a farmer who kept mostly to himself. But when he died, suddenly, violently, people said it was because of the curse. They said Samuel had angered something ancient, something vengeful. And when his body was found, it wasn't just the way he had died that was disturbing. It was the look on his face. His eyes were wide open, his pupils gone, leaving only empty sockets, like 2 hollow voids staring into eternity. That's when it all began. The Hollow-Eyed Man. For years, the town tried to ignore it, but they couldn't escape the truth. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, the Hollow-Eyed Man would appear. His face was a mask of terror, his body gaunt and skeletal, but it was his eyes, those empty sockets, that left the deepest scars. He would walk through the streets, silent and slow, his presence filling the town with dread. And with each appearance, someone would die. At first, it was just whispers. "It's just an old story," people said. "Nothing but a ghost." But then people started to vanish, one by one, in the dead of night. No sign of struggle, no blood. Just an empty space where someone had once been. Detective Sarah Bennett had heard the stories. She'd heard them all her life. But when she arrived in Vesper Hollow to investigate the most recent disappearance, a young woman named Mary who had vanished without a trace, she had no patience for superstition. She believed in facts. She believed in evidence. Ghosts didn't exist. But something wasn't right here. The first night Sarah spent in Vesper Hollow was one she would never forget. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old houses, the rustle of the wind through the trees. She sat in her hotel room, working through the details of the case, when the lights flickered. She frowned, pushing herself to her feet. Power outages were common in small towns, but this felt different. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the air in the room seemed to thicken. It was as if something was watching her. She moved to the window, glancing out into the street. That's when she saw him. The Hollow-Eyed Man. He was standing across the street in the shadows. His face was pale and drawn, his body bent in an unnatural way, like he was more a specter than a man. His eyes were empty. 2 dark voids that stared into the nothingness, and yet, somehow, they seemed to pierce right through her, as if they could see her soul. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew instantly this wasn't just an old ghost story. This was real. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and rushed out into the night. She had to know more. The streets were empty, save for the Hollow-Eyed Man. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his head turned slightly as if he could sense her presence. Sarah followed at a distance, her breath heavy in her chest, her feet silent on the cold pavement. He led her out of town, into the woods, where the trees pressed close and the moonlight barely touched the ground. He stopped by an old abandoned church, a place the townspeople had long since abandoned. Sarah's heart raced as she approached, her eyes fixed on the figure ahead. He turned toward her, and for the first time, Sarah saw his mouth. It was open wide, as if frozen in a scream, but no sound came from him. Just silence. And then, just as she took a step closer, the air grew thick. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. The hollow-eyed man's hollow gaze seemed to turn inward, his eyes now fixated on her. And suddenly, Sarah felt a wave of fear crash over her, so powerful, so consuming, that her knees buckled beneath her. This wasn't just a ghost. This was something else. Something that didn't just haunt the living, it fed on them. The hollow-eyed man took a step forward, his movement slow but inevitable. Sarah staggered back, her mind racing. She had to think, she had to act. But the terror she felt, raw, palpable, was paralyzing. It was as if the creature was drawing the fear from her, making it grow stronger with every breath she took. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, she heard a voice. Not her own, but someone else's. "Get out of here now!" Sarah spun around. It was the voice of an old woman, Mrs. O'Donnell, the town's librarian. She was standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "He feeds on the fear of the living. He's not just a ghost. He's a being from another time, another place. The curse, Samuel Graves didn't die. He became this. And now he's feeding on all of us. He wants us to be afraid. That's how he gets stronger. That's how he chooses who dies." Sarah's mind reeled, the pieces starting to fall into place. The hollow-eyed man wasn't just here to haunt. He was here to feed on their fear, to turn it into something more, something that kept him alive, kept him coming back. "Then how do we stop him?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with desperation. Mrs. O'Donnell's face softened with regret. "You can't. No one can. Not unless you face the fear he's feeding on, not unless you stop running from it." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She understood now. The hollow-eyed man wasn't just terrorizing the town, he was feeding on the fear they let grow. He couldn't be stopped until they stopped fearing him. But it was too late for that. The fear had already consumed them all. As the hollow-eyed man took another step forward, Sarah felt the darkness close in around her, the suffocating grip of terror tightening with every breath. She understood then, in the pit of her stomach, that the creature's hunger would never end. Not until every last soul in Vesper Hollow had been devoured by the fear he had planted in them. And she realized, with a chilling certainty, that she wasn't just trying to solve a case anymore, she was trying to survive. Story number 7. The Hungry Ones Beneath. There are things people don't talk about in the town of Glenwood. Sure, there are rumors. Whispers in the corners of old diners, behind closed doors, and in the hushed voices of the elderly, but they're never confirmed. No one dares to ask questions. Not really, not out loud. Glenwood was always a quiet town. A little too quiet, some said. Nestled between rolling hills and thick woods, it was the kind of place you'd forget about as soon as you left. The streets were empty most of the time, save for the occasional car driving through or kids riding their bikes. The sort of place where nothing ever seemed to change, but in the back of your mind, you could sense that something was off. The tunnels under Glenwood were part of it. Not many knew about them, but there were stories. Old stories. They said that the tunnels had been built long ago, maybe by settlers, maybe by someone else. No one really knew. Over the years, the entrances had been forgotten. covered up by the growth of buildings and streets, sealed off by time. But the tunnels were still there, buried deep beneath the town, winding like veins through the earth. And something lived down there. Something dark. Something hungry. It wasn't until Jesse Martin, a curious boy of 11, decided to venture into the tunnels that anyone really began to understand what the stories had meant. Jesse wasn't like the other kids in town. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters or anything like that. He was stubborn, always poking his nose into places he shouldn't, always asking questions nobody had answers to. That's why, when he heard the whispers about the tunnels, about the creatures that lived below, he couldn't resist. One afternoon, Jesse wandered through the town's old market square, his sneakers kicking up dust as he passed the weathered buildings. He had heard the stories, the ones about how the tunnels had been abandoned, how people once used them during the early years of the town but never returned, the ones about the hungry ones beneath, the ones that thrived in the dark and waited for the right time to emerge. But none of it seemed real to Jesse. It was just something people talked about to scare themselves. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the streets, Jesse found the entrance to the tunnels, hidden behind an old rusted door in a forgotten alleyway. The door was almost completely covered by ivy and brambles, but Jesse could just make out the faint outline of a stairway that led down beneath the earth. His heart beat a little faster, but his curiosity was stronger than any lingering sense of fear. He took a deep breath and without a second thought pushed open the door. The air in the tunnel was thick, damp, and stale. It smelled like dirt and decay, and the walls were slick with moisture. The faintest sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness, and the deeper Jesse went, the more the quiet seemed to press against his ears. The light from the entrance flickered behind him, leaving him in near total darkness. But Jesse didn't stop. He kept walking, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust that covered the floor. He knew the tunnels had been abandoned for years, but something felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. And yet, there was an unsettling sensation growing inside him, like something was watching, waiting. The further he went, the more he felt it. It was subtle at first, a cold breeze that brushed past his neck, a faint whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But soon, it grew stronger. The air grew colder, and Jesse could almost feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. And then, he heard it, a low, guttural sound, a hum, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere deep within the tunnels. Jesse stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes darted around the darkness, but he saw nothing. Still, the sound came again, louder this time. It was followed by a strange shifting, as if something was moving in the shadows. Jesse took another step forward, drawn by the strange noise. His breath caught in his throat as he caught sight of something slithering in the darkness ahead. It was large, its body writhing like a snake, but with a shape that was far too unnatural. It was the size of a man, but its body was twisted, bent in ways that made Jesse's stomach churn. And then it appeared. The creature had no eyes, no mouth, nothing that resembled a face. Its skin was pale and smooth, stretching tight over its twisted form. It had long, spindly arms that ended in sharp claws, and its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if it wasn't quite real. Jesse stood frozen, his legs like stone. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. All he could do was stare into the darkness, as the creature, one of the hungry ones, slithered closer. It made no sound as it approached, but Jesse could feel the weight of its hunger in the air, heavy and thick. He felt it press into his chest like an invisible hand, squeezing the air from his lungs. The creature reached out with one of its long, clawed fingers, and Jesse felt a sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something primal. The fear he had tried to ignore, the terror that had been gnawing at him since he first stepped into the tunnel, suddenly surged within him. It wasn't just the creature that was hungry. It was the fear itself. The more Jesse feared, the stronger the creature became. Jesse tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, the fear consuming him, making his mind foggy and distant. He could feel the creature's presence behind him now, pressing against his back, like it was inside him, suffocating him. And he understood, in that moment, that it wasn't just the creature that fed on fear. It was the fear itself that kept the creature alive. The more scared they were, the stronger it grew, the longer it lived. With a burst of desperate strength, Jesse pushed forward, running through the tunnels, his mind racing, but the creature was faster. It was everywhere, in every shadow, in every corner. He could feel it getting closer, the hunger of it crawling under his skin. By the time Jesse made it back to the surface, the sun had long since set. He stumbled out of the tunnel, his heart racing, his chest tight with terror. But when he looked around, everything was normal. The streets of Glenwood were quiet, just like they always were. The town looked peaceful, the same. But Jesse knew now. He knew the truth. The hungry ones beneath had been waiting for someone like him. Someone curious enough to venture too far into their world. And now, they would never stop feeding. Story number 8, The Waking Nightmares. The town of Elmwood had always been a quiet place. It wasn't the kind of town people talked about in the news or remembered for anything special. It was small, a little run down, but it had a certain charm. A few old buildings, a crumbling park, and streets lined with oak trees that had seen better days. The people of Elmwood had their routines, and life moved slowly, like the river that ran quietly behind the town. But all that changed one warm autumn evening when Sarah Jensen, a teacher at the local high school, woke from a nightmare that felt too real. At first, she brushed it off as just a bad dream. A one-time thing, maybe a product of stress. She had been working hard on lesson plans and grading papers late into the night, so it made sense that her mind had played tricks on her. But then, the nightmares came again, and again. Each night, the monsters in her dreams grew more vivid. They weren't the kind of things you'd see in a horror movie. No, they were worse. They felt like they knew her, like they were watching her, waiting for the moment when they would finally come out of her dreams and into her life. And that night, the nightmare was different. This time, when Sarah woke up with her heart pounding, she heard something. A sound from the darkness in her room. A scratching. Then a thud. She didn't dare move, her breath held tight in her chest. But when she finally gathered the courage to turn on the lamp beside her bed, nothing was there. Just the empty room, just the same walls. But it didn't feel the same. The next morning, Sarah tried to shake off the fear, but as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. The nightmares didn't stop, they got worse. People at work started to talk about the strange dreams they were having. It wasn't just Sarah. Everyone seemed to be suffering. And the monsters weren't the same for everyone. There were those who dreamed of dark, shadowy figures stalking them through endless hallways. Others dreamed of faceless creatures with sharp teeth, lurking in the corners of their homes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Each dream was unique, but they all had one thing in common. They felt real. Too real. People would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their hearts racing, unable to shake the feeling that something was just beyond the reach of their eyes. They saw things moving in the shadows, heard strange noises in the stillness of the night. But when they looked, there was nothing. No explanation. But it was the first death that really started the rumors. Old Mr. Thompson, a quiet man who lived on the edge of town, was found dead in his bed one morning, his eyes wide open in terror. His body was cold, his fingers curled into tight fists, as though he had tried to fight something invisible. His wife, a frail woman who had lived beside him for years, swore she heard him screaming in the night. But when she checked, he was just lying there, his body stiff and lifeless. The town had its suspicions. They tried to explain it away at first. Heart attack, stroke. But everyone knew. Deep down, everyone knew. The nightmares were spilling into the waking world. It wasn't long before the deaths began to pile up. People would wake up with deep scratches on their skin, bruises in places they couldn't explain. But the most terrifying part was the way their faces changed. They were always smiling in their sleep, their mouths twisted into unnatural grins, eyes wide with fear. By the time a second person had died, the townspeople were on edge. Sarah's dreams became more vivid, more frightening. The creatures, no, monsters, had grown bolder. They weren't just lingering in the corners of her nightmares anymore. They were stepping closer, reaching out with sharp claws that scraped at her skin. And every time she woke, she felt the marks on her body, the way they ached, as if the monsters were still there, lingering in the corners of her room. It wasn't just a bad dream anymore. The creatures were real. It was that night when Sarah saw one. She had been walking home from the store, her thoughts lost in the haze of exhaustion, when she saw it. A dark figure standing under the lamppost near the park. At first, she thought it was just someone out for a walk, but then the figure turned, and she froze. The creature's face was distorted, like something that wasn't meant to exist in the real world. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and its smile stretched far too long, a grin that reached its ears, like a jagged cut across its face. It wasn't a person. It was one of the monsters from her nightmares. Sarah's blood ran cold as the creature stepped toward her, its movements jerky, like it was still learning to walk in this world. She turned to run, but when she looked back, the creature was gone, swallowed up by the shadows like it had never been there. She wasn't the only one who saw it. The next day, more people reported seeing the creatures, walking the streets, lurking in alleys, hiding in the dark corners of their homes. They were everywhere, and they were coming for everyone who had dared to dream. The town began to panic. People locked themselves inside, boarded up windows, refused to sleep. They thought if they could just stay awake, stay alert, they might be able to survive. But the creatures were clever. They didn't need to attack during the night anymore. They could walk in the day, blend in with the shadows, and when you least expected it, when you were too tired to fight them, they'd get you. Sarah had to do something. She couldn't live like this anymore. But as she delved deeper into the mystery, she realized the truth. The creatures didn't need to be summoned. They weren't from another world, another dimension. They were born of fear. The fear that had always existed in the town, festering like a wound, growing stronger with every whispered story, every unanswered question. The creatures fed on that fear. The more they feared, the stronger they became. There was no escape. Not anymore. The creatures were part of the town now, part of everyone who lived there. The more they tried to run, the more they tried to hide, the stronger the monsters grew. The town of Elmwood was cursed, and there was no breaking the curse. The nightmares would never end. Story number 9. The Beast in the Walls. The old house on Maple Street had always been a bargain. It was one of those places that people walked past every day and never gave a second thought to. The windows were cracked, the paint chipped, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But for Danny and Lisa Walker, it was perfect. They were a young family, Danny, Lisa, and their 2 kids, Emma and Sam, and they'd been searching for a place of their own for years. When they finally found the house, with its price that seemed too good to be true, they jumped at the opportunity. It was exactly what they needed, a place to start fresh. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of moving in, boxes everywhere, furniture to be arranged, and children running around, excited to explore every room. But as the days went by, things started to change. At first, it was small, just little noises. A creak here, a scratch there. Danny thought it was the house settling, the old beams and walls groaning under the weight of time. Lisa shrugged it off, convinced it was just the house's age showing. They didn't think much of it at first, but the sounds didn't stop. It started with soft scratching noises, like something was trying to get through the walls. It would happen late at night, just when everything else was quiet. It wasn't the sound of a mouse or a squirrel. This was something heavier. Something that scratched and scraped at the walls with purpose, like it was trying to break free. Lisa thought maybe there was something wrong with the plumbing or the pipes, but Danny didn't buy it. He thought it was just the house. Old houses made noises after all. The kids weren't scared at first. Sam, their youngest, was fascinated by the sounds, thinking it was just a part of the house's personality. Emma, their older daughter, was more cautious. She would sit at the dinner table, eyes darting toward the walls every time the scratching began. It was hard for her to ignore the way the sounds seemed to get louder each night, as if whatever was in the walls was getting closer. One night, the sounds were different. Danny had just finished putting the kids to bed when he heard it. A loud bang, followed by a sharp scraping noise, like something had slammed into the wall. His heart raced. He rushed down the hallway, hoping it was just a loose pipe or something else harmless. But when he reached the living room, he froze. The wall in the corner was shaking. He stood there, staring at it. His breath caught in his throat. The shaking stopped, but the air in the room felt thicker, heavier, like something was watching him. He moved closer to the wall, his hand hovering over the spot where the scratching had been the loudest. And then he heard it. A voice. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a voice at all, really. It was more like a growl, low and guttural, coming from deep within the walls. Danny's hand dropped to his side, and his pulse quickened. He couldn't move. He didn't know what to think. The next morning, he went to the basement to check the walls. He figured there might be some kind of animal stuck between the drywall, but when he removed the paneling in the corner, he didn't find a trapped animal. He found something worse. A hole. A large hole had been carved out in the wall, like something, or someone, had been trying to claw its way out for years. The hole was dark, deep, and there was something thick and wet around the edges. Danny reached his hand through, his heart pounding, but before he could feel anything, he pulled it back quickly. He wasn't sure why, he just felt an instinct to retreat, like something was warning him. That night, as he lay in bed, the scratching started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just scratching, it was more like digging. The sound was louder, more insistent, as though something inside the walls was finally tearing its way out. Danny sat up in bed, his heart racing. He wanted to go check the basement again, but he didn't know if he could handle it. Lisa had fallen asleep next to him, but he could feel the tension in the air. The house felt wrong. The noise was louder now, like it was coming from all around them. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. But the silence was worse. For the next few days, the house seemed to hold its breath. The scratching stopped, and Danny tried to reassure his family that it was just the house settling. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't just an old house. It was a house that had been hiding something for years. And whatever it wasn't done yet. The next night, when Danny was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, he heard it. A low growl deep in the walls. He turned toward the noise, and for the first time, he felt a cold wave of terror wash over him. Something was moving inside the walls. He could feel it, like something was shifting just beyond the surface, crawling its way closer. He grabbed a crowbar from the shed outside and went back to the basement. He wasn't going to wait for whatever was in the walls to come to him. He was going to end it. But when he broke through the final piece of drywall, he found something that made him freeze. The walls were hollow, but something had been living there. There were old bones, some of them human, others not. Danny stepped back, his mind racing. He didn't know what he had uncovered, but he knew one thing for sure. The thing in the walls wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an animal. It was a creature that had been trapped, waiting for generations to get out. And it was hungry. The walls began to shake, the house groaning as if it were alive. Danny ran upstairs, his blood running cold. He found Lisa and the kids standing in the hallway, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The growl was growing louder, and the house seemed to be closing in on them. And then, the scratching began again. But this time, it was no longer just in the walls. It was coming from everywhere. Danny slammed the door behind them as the house seemed to tremble with the creature's fury. The family huddled together, but they all knew. The house wasn't just old, it was a prison, and the beast trapped within it had been waiting for a very long time to get out. And now, it was free. Story number 10, The Collector of Souls. There's a village that no one remembers. It's not on most maps, tucked away in the forgotten corners of the world, where time seems to slow and the people seem to vanish as quietly as the seasons change. The village of Ashford Falls. People who pass through on their way somewhere else hardly notice it, and those who stop to rest often find themselves leaving before they ever meant to. It's not that the village is cursed, at least not in the way that most people think of curses. It's just forgotten, like something that's been left behind, lingering in the dust. In the heart of the village, there was a small, unassuming shop, tucked between two crumbling buildings. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, but no one could recall ever seeing anyone walk in or out of the place. The shopkeeper, Mr. Edward Crane, was a quiet, solitary man, always seen wearing a long coat, his face hidden behind a set of round glasses. He was the kind of man you'd forget the moment you turned away. Unremarkable, plain, even forgettable. But there was something about him. Something wrong. The villagers never spoke much about Mr. Crane, but they all knew better than to look too long at him. There was a coldness to him, something distant in his eyes that made people uneasy. The shop, too, was unsettling. It was filled with dusty old books, strange trinkets, and oddities from places no one could identify. The air smelled of old leather and stale paper, like it hadn't been aired out in decades. And the books, there were so many of them, lined the walls, their spines cracked, yellowed with age. But there was one book in particular that always caught people's attention. It sat on the counter, open to a page that no one dared to read. The cover was dark, almost black, and the edges were worn down like it had been handled for years. The book was said to have a strange power about it, something that made people feel uneasy when they stood too close. But it wasn't until that summer, when the heat hung thick in the air and the village grew quiet, that the true horror of the book and Mr. Crane was revealed. It all started with a man named Thomas Hale. He had been a wanderer, drifting from place to place, never staying in one spot too long. Thomas wasn't the kind of person who believed in superstitions. He didn't believe in curses or strange old books. So, when he found himself walking through Ashford Falls one evening, he thought it was just another small town, just another stop on his endless journey. Thomas had never heard of Edward Crane, nor had he ever noticed the little shop before. But when he did, something pulled him inside. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the weight of being alone in the world. Either way, he stepped through the door and into the darkness of the shop. Mr. Crane was behind the counter as usual, his glasses glinting in the dim light. He didn't smile. He didn't say much at all, but he motioned for Thomas to come closer. On the counter, there it was, the book, the one that always made people uncomfortable. "Interested in a story?" Mr. Crane asked, his voice soft, but somehow carrying an edge to it. Thomas laughed, thinking the old man was just offering a bit of entertainment. He picked up the book, ran his fingers along its spine, and glanced at the open pages. The words were written in a language he didn't recognize, but they seemed to swirl and move as though alive. Mr. Crane's eyes never left him. "That book," the old man said quietly, "is not for reading. It is for remembering." But Thomas didn't care. He was bored, restless. He opened the book. The moment he did, something shifted in the air. A coldness swept over him, and for a brief second his vision blurred. But he shrugged it off, thinking it was just fatigue. He tried to close the book, but it wouldn't budge. His fingers were stuck, glued to the pages, as though they had become a part of it. The words began to change. They writhed and twisted, forming new shapes, and before Thomas could understand what was happening, he saw his name written on one of the pages, Thomas Hale. And then he heard it. A low, guttural sound from behind him. A whisper, almost like a growl. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He turned, but there was nothing there. And then the book spoke. "Your soul is mine." Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest. The shadows around him seemed to pull at him, and something cold and wet wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the book. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The creature, whatever it was, had already taken hold. His body stiffened, his vision blurred, and all at once he understood. The book wasn't just a book. It was a trap, a cursed object designed to claim souls. The words written in it didn't just record the names of the doomed, they consumed them. Mr. Crane's eyes glowed faintly, and the smile that spread across his face was no longer just the smile of a man. It was something darker, something monstrous. The creature in the walls, the one Mr. Crane controlled, was awakening. It fed on the souls trapped in the book. The more names written inside, the stronger it became, until it could break free. As Thomas's body withered, his soul slowly drained from him, trapped forever in the cursed pages. The same thing had happened to countless others, victims of Mr. Crane's terrible secret. But that night something changed. A group of people, strangers to Ashford Falls, had arrived. 5 souls, desperate to escape their own troubled lives. They were drawn to the village, unaware of what awaited them. They'd heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. Not until they stepped into the shop. Mr. Crane was waiting for them, but this time he wasn't alone. The book was open, its pages blank for now, but the creatures in the walls were restless. The 5 strangers could feel it, and as they stared at the book, each one saw their name written inside it. The collector was ready. The souls would be his. But these strangers were different. They weren't going to give in. The battle for their lives had just begun, and the collector of souls would soon learn that some souls are harder to take than others.